Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first week of our course, History 335, Famine, Farming, and Fraud, here at SUNY Delhi. I'm your professor, Dan Gashler. I'm looking forward to getting to know you all and working with all of you. So what you're watching right now is a weekly lecture that's meant to contextualize and perhaps problematize the readings that you'll be using in this course. This is a 7-week course made up of 3 requirements. First, each week you'll have a set of focus questions to answer based on readings that are posted to Vanco Hall for that week. There's no textbook to buy. Everything is posted to Vanco Hall. So I require your answers to be a minimum of 750 words total. That's all of your answers complete. So in your answers, I want to see that you understand the points the authors are making, and more importantly, that you can weigh in on them with your own take. I want to see your own analysis. So I would like you to email me your answers each week, and they are due by Sunday at midnight. So let me know if any deadline is going to be a problem for you for any reason, and certainly we can work something out. So this is the part of the course where you really familiarize yourself with a broad swath of important literature on changes in 20th century agriculture. That's the focus questions. So then, the next requirement is I want you to participate in a weekly discussion board. I actually opened it up a week ago, and I see that some of you have already posted, so nice work. But this is due by Thursday at midnight of each week, and I want you to make a post that answers the question or questions that I pose with at least 200 words. And I grade all of them. I grade the discussion boards rather lightly. I really just want to see that you are participating. I want to see you engaging with the ideas, much like we would be doing in a physical classroom. So put your initial post by Thursday night, and then by Sunday night, I want you to comment on at least 2 of your classmates' posts. No word limit for that. I mean, you can write them a novel, or just a few words is fine. So the final requirement of this class, then, there will be a final paper of 10 to 12 pages, and I will post the requirements and parameters of this paper on Vanco Hall very soon. So the paper is really, I hope that you get excited about the paper, not intimidated by it. It is your chance to practice solid research and good critical thinking skills, and I am more than happy to work with you because I want these papers to be amazing. So the focus questions are worth 33% of your grade, the discussion boards are worth 33% of your grade, and the paper is worth 34% of your grade. So just 3 things in this class. So hopefully the requirements of this course are easy to grasp, and I like to keep that part of things fairly simple. So remember, what I just told you is all on the syllabus. So the syllabus is posted at the top of Ankle Hall, and you are welcome to look at it whenever you'd like. And another thing I should mention that's in the syllabus, but I have office hours every morning from 9 to 10 a.m. at a Zoom link that's posted at the top of our Vanco Hall page. You don't need an appointment or anything. You just stop in, and if there happen to be more than one, if there happens to be more than one person talking with me, I will just talk with people, in a first come first serve basis. All right, let's get into the course itself, and maybe shrink my face, or maybe put my face all the way out of this frame for now. All right. So I have structured this as a history of 20th century global agriculture. This is both a history class and a component of the sustainability program here on campus. So the beauty of history is in its ability to give context and meaning to the social, political, cultural, and agricultural questions of the present. So as this brief term develops, I want to tell a story that celebrates the incredible innovations of 20th century agriculture. We live in a world today where overcoming hunger is a realistic possibility. So this course then won't just be a celebration of agriculture, though. I also want to look at some of the colossal failures and, frankly, instances of what I think can best be termed fraud that led to horrific and completely unnecessary famines. I also want to look at critiques of conventional agriculture with a conclusion which you're encouraged to challenge, that to have sustainable agriculture in the future, we need to continue to include large conventional producers. But there certainly needs to be space, as there is now, for every variant of organic and what's often called bio agriculture, and in other countries, bio, uh, as well. Alongside the inspiring agricultural resistance movements springing up among oppressed peoples in so much of the world, people who realize that if they can take control of their food, they can hopefully have a basis for taking control of every other part of, the societies that oppress them. So basically, the point I want to make is that if you're growing food, there shouldn't be a need for animosity. Food producers are all on the same team. So to do this, to make this point in the course, I hope to challenge some of the stereotypes within organic agricultural publications or discourses, for instance, on how they oftentimes imagine conventional producers to be. And I also want to challenge some of the stereotypes that big conventional producers sometimes have about small producers. So let's skip slides here. Here, I'll put my face back in here. Here we go. Little face. All right. So this is a course on 20th century agriculture. So naturally, then, this week our readings are going to focus on the 19th century, with your first reading jumping all the way back to the end of the 18th century. So the late 18th century was a time of intense optimism in world history. It was a period of revolutions like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, that promised to reimagine societies according to rational scientific bases. Improved agriculture and animal husbandry were among the pursuits that wealthy intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson felt could eliminate famines and even hunger. So, in the midst of this environment of optimism, you've also got a studious mathematician and aristocrat, Thomas Malthus, whose pamphlet that I gave you, well, actually, I gave you the whole thing, but you only need to read the first 11 pages of it. Um, his pamphlet seemed like the biggest wet blanket to throw on the optimism of his era. So the excerpt that I want you to read outlines his basic premise that when agricultural productivity increases arithmetically or in a linear fashion, human population increases exponentially or geometrically. So in his assessment, this would always lead to poverty among the lowest classes, and in more extreme cases, it would lead to famine. So he set up this proposition with mathematical certainty. He also was writing as a direct rebuttal to two of the most prominent optimists of his day. There was the Marquis de Condorcet, an early French sociologist of sorts who had just published his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind. This work argued that the possibilities of the human mind were essentially limitless, and he even mused that human beings might someday figure out scientific medicinal means to live almost forever. And Malthus was also writing against Adam Smith, whose ideas of capitalism in works like On the Wealth of Nations argued that if people could be free to engage in whatever enterprise they wanted, based only on their own self-interest, without aristocratic, monopolistic, or government interference, that a sort of invisible hand would regulate things to create optimum prosperity for society as a whole. Malthus argued that both of these ideas were naive. Importantly, Malthus gained a huge following in the coming decades. His ideas continue to inform economic policies around the world. The draconian Chinese one-child policy was based on the Malthusian premise that resources are limited, and the only way for China to become a prosperous, poverty-free country was to drastically limit its population growth. The Chinese government recently amended that policy as they're now worried about having enough population to care for their aging population. But many in China and outside of China see the country's current wealth, where Xi Jinping recently announced the elimination of extreme poverty, to be a testament to things like their one-child policy or the ideas of Malthus. So Malthus, though, of course, has also been criticized, notably early on by socialists, for failing to see the potential of the science and ideas of his day to produce things like the Industrial Revolution and the massive agricultural revolution of the next 2 decades, notably the Green Revolution. Sorry, not the next 2 decades, the next 2 centuries. Notably, the Green Revolution of the 1940s through the 1980s, where agricultural productivity also increased exponentially. So, since Malthus's writing, many in world history have tried to argue that the so-called Malthusian paradox was short-sighted and dismissive of the massive potential of humanity for progress. Certainly, the world of today is profoundly different than the world of 1798. So in this class, I want to celebrate that progress while keeping in mind the ecological critique of that progress, with the hope that this historicization can help all of us to put our own career choices and personal actions into historical context as we work to create a more equitable and sustainable world. So keep that Malthusian paradox in the background as we contextualize your other readings for this week. And this is where Adam Smith's ideas become a little more important, and certainly there will be a critique, hard word to say, critique of them as well. So in the early 19th century, two schools of thought on political economy battled it out, largely in the UK and the United States, but certainly, within the broader world as well. The liberal and the conservative. So, like liberals and conservatives today, neither was ever particularly consistent in their beliefs. Unlike liberals and conservatives today, though, many of their tenets of their beliefs were almost the opposite of what they are today. Liberals, often following the ideas of Adam Smith, believed that government should encourage business and free markets. They were against public assistance as they thought markets should take care of people, not governments. Conservatives, on the other hand, wanted to protect noble and aristocratic privilege. So in places like England, they made up the conservatives were the landholding class, whose wealth came from either agriculture at home or plantations run by enslaved people, particularly in the Caribbean. So conservatives were often in favor of public assistance, as they saw it as preserving the social order of their day, and they were generally opposed to factories and free trade, as they saw both as threats to their wealth and social dominance. So I want you to keep that in the background as we jump to your phoner reading. Oop. Okay, so my face disappeared. That's all right. You're fine without my face. So I want to tie together three agricultural movements, one of which I have pictured here, all happening in the 1840s. So in the chapter that I assigned for this week by Eric Foner, you've got a great discussion of Northern attitudes towards Southerners in the run-up to the Civil War. One of the key stereotypes that Northerners had was that the South was inefficient, unproductive, and lazy. That laziness was built around a system where personal enterprise wasn't rewarded because anyone trying to engage in agriculture or really any other venture had to compete with the aristocratic slave-holding class who lived off the forced labor of others. As the enslaved worked for nothing, free laborers couldn't compete with that. And the enslaving class, well, they were amongst the least efficient as they never appreciated the value of hard work, as their slaves did all the work for them. So the result was soil that was exhausted, farms in relative ruin, and enslaved people who had no motivation other than simply trying to survive. In the North, however, in the same period, a total American agricultural revolution was underway. We'll read more about some of the nuts and bolts of that next week, which got some exciting readings. But in the period before, during and shortly after the Civil War, some of the most incredible innovations in mechanized agriculture occurred right here in the United States. So for fun, I want to localize things a little bit. Many of you have probably seen this sign before, north of Delhi on Route 10. And I want to look at a precursor to this really serious transformation in American agriculture that happened right here in Delaware County. So for those of you not in the area, that's the county where Delhi is. It was at the epicenter of national politics during the 1840s and into the 1850s. So in that period, most of Delaware County was owned from a Revolutionary War era land grant to the Rensselaer family in the Albany area. They amassed a fabulous fortune primarily from collecting rent. The farmers of the area were in a crisis by the 1840s, though. Delaware County has rocky, terrible soil. It's good for grazing, but before the widespread development of dairy technology, Sheep were the big deal here. That's why there's still so many stone walls around. They were for sheep and built by the earliest settlers. We actually have them in the woods of Delhi campus. If you've ever walked above campus, you can see stone walls built in the early 19th century. You can walk on them. You can jump around on them. Some fraternities have actually built a fort out of them, which is kind of cool. So in the 1840s, cotton, though, had taken over wool for textiles. So suddenly, the productivity of the South, the Industrial Revolution based on cotton, which is much easier to work with than wool, meant that all these sheep farmers here in Delaware County didn't really have a market for their sheep anymore. So uh, the price of wool plummeted, but rent stayed the same. And it was incredibly difficult to grow wheat or anything else marketable here, but rent stayed the same. So in 1845, a group of people started an anti-rent rebellion. They figured that they were paying the value of the land every 7 years in rent, and it was unsustainable. As a side note, I rented farmland a few years ago and paid about the same proportion, but prices were good, and you could make money off of it. So this anti-rent movement, they published newspapers. They would dress like native people and harass rent collectors. In one really egregious moment, they even killed the sheriff of Delaware County near Andes in 1845, Osamond Steele. Uh, by the late 1840s, the movement petered out, in part because land was available for sale by then. But they showed that Americans didn't want to be treated like European feudal serfs, and they felt that land was a right. This would eventually lead to the Homestead Act, opening up vast amounts of land in the West for anyone who could lay claim to it for 5 years. Many people from Delaware County simply moved west then in this period, including actually my wife's ancestors who were from Delaware County at the time. So, anyways, this is what I'm trying to tie into, our previous discussion about conservatives and liberals. Conservatives and liberals in the 18th century believe things that are roughly the opposite of many of their tenets today, globally, not just in the United States. But liberals in particular believe that people should have the right to control their own enterprises, whereas conservatives believe that land should remain land ownership should remain the purview of aristocratic landed nobility. So liberals, on the other hand, were all for innovation, progress, for technology, for doing everything they could uh, to you know to be able to make a living for individuals, and they're the ones who would eventually win out in changes in American agriculture. So and you're reading about that in your phone or reading. So the anti-rent movement dovetailed quite well with other mid-19th century movements like the free soil movement that essentially argued that the massive lands stolen from native peoples in the West should be available for free farmers, and that the power of slaveholders should be restricted. The later Grange movement and widespread efforts to develop farmer cooperative unions all work together. The pinnacle of the free soil movement was the Homestead Act, finally passed in 1862, then again in 1866. This act would give a quarter section. A section is a square mile, so a quarter of a square mile or 160 acres to anyone who could pay a nominal clerk's fee and farm the land for 5 years. So this act led to an absolutely incredible period of economic growth in the United States. America's first industrial revolution centered around textile production, for which the South was crucial, especially the slaveholding economy of the South. But the second centered around heavy manufacturing, especially the kind of manufacturing needed for farm implements, which were necessary to the many farmers in the Midwest and West who now had more land than they could handle with, the technologies that were prominent in the day. So as American steel mills and foundries rose to the challenge of equipping a nation of farmers, you had rapid economic growth that served as an incredible pull factor inviting immigrants to America. Recruiters for large new factories like the McCormick or John Deere companies, centered in the Midwest, would tour Europe and the Ottoman Empire, seeking workers, promising streets paved in gold. The states of Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, similarly went to Europe and even parts of the Middle East, trying to seek out workers. By the end of the 19th century, American factories, transportation infrastructure, and enterprising farmers had made the United States of America into one of the largest economies in the world. This combination of innovation, land, stolen land, and immigrants made this possible. So in the picture, you see the Bethlehem Steel Mill of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, before it became a casino. That's what it is today. I won't get too much into this now, as that's more in your readings for next week. But immigration, land, and innovation led to this incredible period of economic growth. I want to emphasize too that Americans weren't alone in their understanding that prosperity was tied to freedom and land. So that's one of the reasons I gave you a reading that deals with the Russian Empire as well. In the Russian Empire, people were thinking the same thing at the same time. At the same time that Americans were clamoring for free land and an end to slavery, Russians were also clamoring for land to be held by serfs and for an end to their system of serfdom. So one of the lessons learned by Tsar Nicholas I's successor, Alexander II, was that Russia lost the Crimean War, which was 1853 to 1856, because of their horrible underdevelopment. Russia had no railroads at the time. It took them months to resupply troops fighting in their own empire. Well, the British and French were able to resupply troops in a fraction of that time, coming by sea from across the continent. So during his reign, Alexander II tried to remedy this underdevelopment by engaging in comprehensive changes called the Great Reforms, which mimicked much of what was happening around the world at this same time. So they focused on, the usual subjects for people trying to modernize a country in the 1800s. They wanted to promote better infrastructure, build railroads, telegraphs, and promote the building of factories. And they wanted to modernize their military, but they also wanted to transform society. So in 1861, Russians abolished the institution of serfdom. 80% of Russians were still serfs before this decree, which actually predated the first Emancipation Proclamation in the U.S. by 2 years. Serfs weren't the same as African-descended slaves in the Western Hemisphere. Serfs did have legal rights in Russia. They could even take their masters to court, but they could be bought and sold. Families could be split up, and they were not allowed to leave their estates without permission, unless they could make it to the frontier regions and join a Cossack regiment. Once in the frontier, they were free, at least traditionally, provided they could be called upon as cavalry in time of war. But recognizing the value of freedom to building free markets, the Russians decided to give it a try. So over the next decades, Russia prospered as a free economy came into existence, relatively so, as old restrictions on Jewish life were abandoned and as literacy blossomed among what had been one of the most illiterate empires on earth. The rate of prosperity wasn't as fast as reformers wanted, though, so radicalism also flourished, both on the extreme right, as evidenced through frequent anti Semitic pogroms, and radical nationalism, as well as on the left, which would culminate with the revolutions of 1905 and 1917. But for a few decades, Russians modernized much the same way as everyone else in the world was doing. And we're going to come back to Russia in the 20th century. These great reforms would become the basis of so many of the radical moves of collectivization in the 1930s that would lead to horrific famines, a form of fraud. So the final reading I gave you for this week is the history portion from a sociological work that examines African American efforts to attain liberation through agriculture. So this is a theme that you'll see in the background of so many of our readings this semester. As Governments, resistance groups, or groups of people, however they sociologically construct themselves, seek to reimagine their identity and empower their people. They so often seem to turn to agriculture. There's something intrinsic to the idea that our connection to the earth, to our sustenance, can help to reimagine our relationship to everything around us. Agriculture and food procurement have sacred status in many, and perhaps most, societies on earth. So the chapter I assigned you examines primarily African Americans in the period after Reconstruction. So it is also through the person of W.E.B. Du Bois, which examines black people more broadly in the aftermath of enslavement in the United States with the ongoing specter of colonialism globally. So the chapter starts with Booker T. Washington, who sought to create an agricultural, technical, and educational basis to uplift black people. Your author acknowledges the statements he made in his life that seem to support the race based caste system of his day, but also wants to somewhat rehabilitate his image by emphasizing his role in creating the Tuskegee Institute. So for Washington, this seemed the best possible way to work within the system that existed for the betterment of black people. It also was and continues to be an incredibly innovative institution. I mean, the Tuskegee Institute is awesome. So the author of this book has a lot more admiration in this excerpt for George Washington Carver and everything he both did and symbolized. Carver was actually born into slavery. He was drawn towards botany as a child, loved plants, and pursued that interest into a successful academic career in his adulthood. When given the opportunity to work at the Tuskegee Institute, he jumped at the chance, as he cared deeply about not only uplifting his people, but healing the very physical damage that slavery had done to the earth itself. I love the details that you have in your excerpt for today. How Carver gave up lucrative jobs for the sake of continuing his work, his life's mission at Tuskegee. Many of you have probably heard of the many uses of peanuts he came up with. That seems like something we learn in elementary school. Peanuts, they're a legume that grows well in many parts of the South and naturally fixates nitrogen into the soil, something that cotton, by contrast, leaches out of it. So, he, Carver was quite literally healing the land that had been destroyed by slavery, but he was also all about healing the people who had been destroyed by slavery. So what I loved about this chapter though was the work he did, just in that regard to heal the people. Uh, Carver's work, Carver, was intended for the most oppressed of Southern farmers. He pioneered many of the principles of organic agriculture, becoming an inspiration to Rodale, who had coined the term decades later. Organic agriculture was something Carter saw as a necessity. Uh, Black people, they didn't have access to synthetic fertilizers. They didn't have access to improved seeds because of the explicitly racist and structures and societies they lived within. So they had to promote soil health through composting and enriching soil with whatever was available. Carver's thousands of bulletins and brochures were intended to provide the greatest possible diversity of commodities for black people to grow for their own food, to feed others, and even for industrial purposes. I mean, his research is incredible. Uh, I also love that the author includes Du Bois in this discussion as well. Sorry, made a mistake here. So, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first social scientists to systematically investigate black agriculture and black cooperative movements in the post-Civil War era. I actually was planning to assign a chapter from his book, Black Reconstruction in America, before deciding on this book instead, as it does a better job of contextualizing Du Bois's ideas within their broader context. But Du Bois dedicated his life to helping black people organize to be able to have opportunities denied them. He and Marcus Garvey were early founders of the idea of Pan-Africanism, that African descended people around the world needed to combine their efforts, that the racism of colonialism was the same as the racism of Jim Crow. Uh, Du Bois would be key in organizing the Pan-African Conference of 1919. That would lead to more conferences that would lead to the end of colonialism across Africa and the Caribbean. As someone who felt himself part of the African diaspora, he actually immigrated to and died in free and independent Ghana. So, as a side note, to this day, Ghana proclaims itself as a home for African descended people and invites African Americans in particular to come home to Africa, much the same way Israel bills itself as a home for all Jewish people in the world. So for Du Bois, though, cooperative agriculture was a means to allowing African diaspora people to build foundations for their own communities to uplift everyone, not just the so-called talented 10% that he sometimes focused on in his other works. Okay, so I hope that this gives you some useful background information to contextualize your readings. Next week, we'll really get into the 20th century and nerd out a bit on some fun agricultural innovations. I hope you all enjoy your first week of this class, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me if there's anything you'd like to discuss. Remember, I have office hours every morning from 9 to 10 a.m. at the Zoom link listed at the top of the Vanco Hall page for this class. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you and hope you have a great first week of this class or ninth week of your full semester classes. So on this slide then, you've got some fun softball bonus questions. If you answer them all correctly, you can earn up to 10% of the course grade in extra credit by the end of the term. So it's like my sort of fun way to get you to engage a little more deeply with these presentations. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good first week of this class.